She thought it would be for a few nights only, until the billionaire whispered, "You're mine forever." Hello, lovely people. Welcome to Dr. Tom's Love Tales, your home to relax and enjoy the most touching love stories. Before we begin, kindly let us know which part of the world you're watching from below. Your global presence fills my heart with such warmth and gratitude. I'm your host, Dr. Tom, and now a divine prayer for you, my family of light. Oh, loving Creator, please watch over my family today. Bless their bodies with strength, their hearts with hope, and their homes with peace. When they cry, wipe their tears with the gentlest wind. When they are tired, cradle them in quiet comfort. When they doubt, whisper truth into their spirit. You are worthy. You are loved. You are never alone. Send angels to stand at their doors to guard their peace, their children, their dreams. And above all, give them joy so deep it heals the parts of them they don't talk about. Amen. Now, my beautiful family, I ask you, how do you think of my stories? Are my stories healing you, loving you, embracing you? Comment yes if you feel seen, valued, and forever part of this sacred family. Also, please like and share because someone out there needs this love too. Let's rise together, love together, and now begin with a heart full of peace and a soul drenched in love. Julia Tucker was just 7 years old on that Tuesday morning that forever changed how she understood love. Sitting at the kitchen table with her bowl of cereal, she watched her father pack his suitcase by the front door. The morning sunlight streamed through their small apartment window, casting shadows that seemed to dance around his hurried movements. "Where are you going, Daddy?" little Julia asked, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Her father paused, his hand gripping the handle of his worn leather suitcase. He looked at her with eyes that couldn't quite meet hers, and said the words that would echo in her mind for decades to come. "I'll be back tomorrow, sweetheart. Just need to take care of some business." Tomorrow came and went, then the next day, and the next. Julia would sit by that same window every morning, watching for a figure that never appeared on their street. Her mother's reaction was swift and devastating. Within a week of his departure, the woman Julia had known as warm and loving transformed into someone cold and distant. "Maybe if you were better, he would have stayed," her mother said one evening, staring at the empty chair where her husband used to sit. "Maybe if you hadn't been so demanding, so needy, he wouldn't have felt the need to leave." Those words burned themselves into Julia's 7-year-old heart. Love, she learned, was conditional. Love was something you could lose if you weren't good enough, if you asked for too much, if you made someone's life too difficult. Love was temporary, fragile, and dangerous to depend upon. From that day forward, Julia began building the first walls around her heart. She stopped asking her mother for bedtime stories. She stopped seeking comfort when she scraped her knees. She learned to take care of herself, to need nothing from anyone, because needing meant risking the kind of abandonment that could destroy you. By college, Julia had transformed her childhood wounds into academic excellence. She was brilliant, driven, and completely self-reliant. At Harvard, she threw herself into economics with a passion that impressed even her most demanding professors. For the first time since her father left, she allowed herself to trust someone, her roommate and best friend, Natalie. Natalie was everything Julia wasn't: warm, social, effortlessly charming. She drew Julia out of her shell, encouraged her to share her ideas, and became the sister Julia had never had. For 3 years, they were inseparable. Julia even began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could trust someone completely. During their senior year, Julia developed a revolutionary economic thesis on sustainable urban development financing. It was groundbreaking work that combined environmental economics with social impact investing in ways that had never been attempted before. She spent months perfecting every detail, every calculation, every projection. She shared everything with Natalie: her research, her conclusions, her dreams of changing how cities approach development. This could change everything. Natalie said, reading through Julia's work late one night in their dorm room. This could actually make sustainable housing profitable for developers while keeping it affordable for families. Julia felt a warmth she hadn't experienced since childhood. Someone understood her vision, believed in her work, supported her dreams. She was so grateful to have found a friend who truly saw her. 2 weeks before the deadline for the prestigious Goldman Sachs internship application, Julia discovered that Natalie had submitted Julia's entire thesis as her own work. Every equation, every innovation, every breakthrough that Julia had labored over for months, Natalie had claimed it all. The confrontation was devastating. Julia found Natalie in the library, calmly reviewing what had been Julia's life's work as if it were her own creation. "How could you take my work? I trusted you with everything," Julia said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "I shared my deepest work with you because I thought you were my friend." Natalie looked up with cold eyes that Julia had never seen before. "That was your mistake, not mine," she said simply. "You should have known better than to trust someone with something that valuable. I just took advantage of an opportunity you were too naive to protect." The internship went to Natalie. Julia's work, her innovations, her dreams all credited to someone who had never had an original thought about economics in her life. But worse than losing the opportunity was losing her faith in human connection. If Natalie could betray her so completely after 3 years of friendship, then no one could ever be trusted. Julia's rise on Wall Street was meteoric and ruthless, fueled by a burning desire to prove that she didn't need any, especially not the company that had rejected her for stolen work. She started at a smaller firm, working 18-hour days, channeling every ounce of pain and betrayal into becoming the most formidable financial analyst in New York. 3 years later, when Goldman Sachs approached her with an offer she couldn't refuse, Julia felt the sweet taste of vindication. She walked into their offices not as a desperate intern applicant, but as a proven talent they were begging to acquire. Her first day at Goldman Sachs, Julia stepped off the elevator onto the 42nd floor and saw a familiar face behind a desk in the analyst pool. Natalie looked up from her computer, and for a moment, shock flickered across her features. She had clearly expected to never see Julia again. Well, Natalie said, recovering her composure with a brittle smile. "Look who finally made it to the big leagues." Julia stared at her former friend, the woman who had stolen her dreams and built a mediocre career on stolen brilliance. Natalie was still in the same junior analyst position she'd held since graduation, while Julia was being brought in 2 levels above her. "Hello, Natalie," Julia said calmly. "I see you're still here." The years that followed were a masterclass in professional warfare disguised as corporate success. Julia rose through the ranks with devastating efficiency, while Natalie watched from the sidelines, her resentment growing with each of Julia's promotions. What made it worse was that Julia never acknowledged their past. She treated Natalie with the same cold professionalism she showed everyone else, as if their shared history meant nothing. By year 5, Julia had her corner office and 7-figure salary, while Natalie remained trapped in middle management, watching her former victim become everything she'd dreamed of being. The irony was delicious and bitter. Julia had succeeded at the very company where Natalie worked, using nothing but her own talent and relentless determination. The Ice Queen, they called Julia behind her back, and she wore the title like armor. She never collaborated on projects, never sought input from colleagues, never formed alliances or friendships. When clients questioned her methods, she showed them her track record flawless, independent, and devastatingly effective. Her corner office was a monument to her success and her isolation. Awards lined the walls, not a single personal photograph among them. Financial charts and market analyses covered every surface, but there was nothing that spoke to who Julia was beyond her work. Meanwhile, Natalie seethed in her smaller office 3 floors below, plotting and waiting for the day when Julia's arrogance would finally be her downfall. She watched every deal Julia closed, Every client relationship Julia managed, looking for weaknesses, for opportunities to strike back at the woman who had surpassed her using the very vision Natalie had tried to steal. Julia's studio apartment in Manhattan told the same story of brilliant isolation, complex algorithms predicting market movements, innovative investment strategies that had earned her clients millions, revolutionary approaches to risk assessment that had changed how the firm operated. But walking through her home, you would never know that a human being lived there. No family photos, no mementos from friendships, no trace of connection to another living soul. The loneliness was suffocating, but vulnerability felt like death. Julia had learned that depending on others led to devastation, that trusting someone gave them the power to destroy you. Better to be alone and safe than connected and vulnerable. And if Natalie thought she could wait her out, she was wrong. Julia had already won the war that mattered. Meanwhile, miles away stood Justin Walker, a man whose silence would cost him everything. Justin's childhood was marked by a stutter that seemed to worsen whenever emotions ran high. While other children spoke freely, Justin struggled to find his voice, especially during moments when speaking up mattered most. His parents, well-meaning but impatient, often finished his sentences or spoke for him entirely, inadvertently teaching him that his voice wasn't necessary. The pattern continued through his teenage years. During stress, anxiety, or emotional moments, Justin's ability to communicate simply vanished. He became what his family called selectively mute, perfectly capable of speech in calm moments, but completely unable to articulate when it truly counted. The defining moment came when Justin was 25. His father had passed away suddenly, leaving behind a complex will that required family discussion and decision-making. The family business, a small but successful construction company that had been in the Walker family for 3 generations, hung in the balance. During the will reading, it became clear that Justin's father had intended for both sons to inherit equal shares of the business. But there was a clause that required verbal agreement from both brothers about the direction of the company within 30 days of the reading. Justin's younger brother David had different ideas about expanding into commercial development, while Justin believed they should focus on affordable housing projects that served working families. When the lawyer asked for their decision, David spoke passionately about his vision for the company's future. Then all eyes turned to Justin. This was his moment to advocate for his beliefs, to speak up for the mission he believed his father would have supported, to claim his rightful place in the family legacy. But as the room filled with expectant silence, Justin's throat closed. The anxiety of the moment, the weight of his grief, the pressure of everyone waiting it all, combined to rob him of his voice completely. He sat there, opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water, unable to produce a single word. After 20 minutes of painful silence, the lawyer ruled that David's vision would proceed by default. The family business was restructured according to David's plans, prioritizing profit over the community focus that had been its foundation. David's final words to Justin as they left the lawyer's office cut deeper than any physical wound. "Your fear of speaking up destroyed our family's legacy. Dad wanted us to build something together, but your silence just handed everything to me. I hope your cowardice was worth losing your birthright." 5 years later, Justin, with his bright mind, had built his own real estate empire, but his inability to communicate emotionally continued to sabotage every relationship he attempted. He met Amanda at a charity function. She was warm, compassionate, and patient with his communication struggles. For 2 years, she tried to draw him out, to help him express his feelings, to build the emotional intimacy that every relationship needs to survive. The test came when Amanda's mother was diagnosed with advanced cancer. Amanda needed emotional support, someone who could hold space for her grief, someone who could offer comfort through words and presence. Justin wanted desperately to be that person for her. He felt everything she needed him to feel: love, empathy, the desire to carry her pain and make it lighter. But when Amanda came home from doctor visits in tears, when she needed him to tell her everything would be okay, when she begged him to just talk to her about what they were facing together. Justin's voice disappeared. He could hold her physically, but he couldn't find the words that would have made her feel less alone. The night Amanda's mother passed away, she turned to Justin and said, "I need you to tell me we're going to get through this together. I need you to say something, anything, that helps me feel less alone in this moment." Justin sat beside her hospital bed, his heart breaking for her pain, his mind racing with all the things he wanted to say, but his throat felt sealed shut. The anxiety of the moment, the weight of her need, the pressure to be emotionally presented all combined to render him completely mute. After an hour of silence, Amanda looked at him with eyes full of tears and disappointment. "I need a partner, not a beautiful statue," she said quietly. "I can't do this life with someone who can't be emotionally present when I need them most." She left him the next week, and Justin couldn't even find the words to ask her to stay. Now, at 35, Justin lived in his Manhattan penthouse like a king in exile. The apartment was a testament to his success: floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, designer furniture that belonged in magazines, art collections that spoke to his refined taste and unlimited budget. But it was also a monument to his loneliness. Every relationship felt transactional because he couldn't access the emotional vocabulary to make it real. Business partners respected his vision and his results, but they didn't know him. Women were initially attracted to his success and his mysterious quiet nature, but they eventually left when they realized that his silence wasn't depth, it was emptiness. What people didn't know was that Justin had been following Julia's work obsessively for months. He read every analysis she published, studied every market prediction she made, watched every interview she gave. It wasn't just professional interest, it was recognition. In her carefully controlled public appearances, in the way she held herself apart from colleagues, in the brilliant isolation that defined her approach to work, Justin saw a kindred spirit. He recognized someone else who had been hurt so deeply that protection had become more important than connection. Someone else who had built walls so high that they had forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. Someone else who was successful, respected, and completely alone. He had never spoken to her, never even been in the same room as her, but Justin understood Julia Tucker in a way that went beyond professional admiration. He saw in her the same painful isolation that defined his own life, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone in his loneliness. The Children's Hospital Charity Gala should have been routine networking for Julia Tucker, but she arrived that evening, carrying the weight of her career's darkest day. Her biggest client, Harrison Pharmaceuticals, had questioned not just her market projections, but her fundamental competence as an analyst. Maybe a woman isn't cut out for this kind of high-pressure decision-making, Harrison's CEO had said during their afternoon meeting, his words cutting through Julia like a blade. "Perhaps we need someone with a stronger stomach for the really big numbers." The accusation stung because it echoed every doubt Julia had ever carried about her worth, every whisper she'd heard in corporate hallways, every moment she'd wondered if her success was real or just luck. She'd built her entire identity around being unshakable, untouchable, better than anyone who dared question her abilities. But today, for the first time in years, those walls had felt fragile. Now she stood by the silent auction display, elegant in her black evening gown but radiating the defensive energy of someone barely holding themselves together. Her posture was perfect, her expression controlled, but anyone who looked closely could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone preparing for battle. Julia scanned the room full of New York's elite, recognizing faces from magazine covers and boardroom meetings. Everyone seemed to be part of conversations, part of connections, part of something bigger than themselves. She remained apart, as always, but tonight her isolation felt less like choice and more like exile. Across the ballroom, Justin Walker had been watching her for over an hour. He recognized her immediately, not just from her occasional television appearances, but from the countless hours he'd spent studying her work. In person, she was even more striking than in photographs, but what drew his attention wasn't her beauty. It was the way she stood alone in a room full of people, the same careful distance he maintained at every social gathering. Justin's social anxiety had been at full throttle since arriving. The noise, the crowds, the expectation of small talk and networking it all combined to make his throat tight and his palms sweaty. He'd been planning his escape for the past 30 minutes, but something about Julia's isolated stance kept him rooted in place. He watched as person after person approached her briefly, exchanged pleasantries, then moved on. She was polite but distant, engaging just enough to be professional but never enough to be warm. Justin recognized the technique because he used it himself, the art of being present while remaining completely unreachable. But there was something different about her tonight. Usually, in her interviews and public appearances, Julia projected absolute confidence. Tonight, she looked like someone fighting an invisible war and losing. The recognition hit Justin like a physical blow. Here was someone else who understood what it felt like to be successful and completely alone, respected and entirely isolated. Someone else who had built walls so high that they'd forgotten what connection felt like. For the first time in months, Justin's social anxiety began to recede. Not because the situation was less intimidating, but because he suddenly had something more important than his fierce desire to reach someone who looked as lonely as he felt. Justin approached Julia with trembling hands but steady purpose. When she looked up at him, her green eyes were guarded but curious. "Julia Tucker," he said, his voice quieter than he'd intended but clearer than it had been all evening. "I'm Justin Walker. Your housing market analysis from last quarter saved my development company $2 million. I wanted to thank you." The moment their eyes met, something shifted in the air between them. For Julia, his genuine appreciation, not networking, not manipulation, just honest gratitude, cracked something inside her she'd kept locked away since Natalie's betrayal. Here was someone who saw her work, understood its value, and respected what she'd built. "Well, your sustainable housing project in Queens," Julia replied, surprise evident in her voice. "The financing structure was genius. You found a way to make affordable housing profitable without displacing existing communities." Justin felt his chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. She knew his work. Not just knew it, but understood the philosophy behind it, the careful balance between profit and purpose that most developers never even attempted. They talked for 20 minutes about community development, about building something meaningful instead of just profitable. Julia found herself sharing ideas she'd never voiced, theories she'd kept private for fear they'd be stolen or dismissed. Justin discovered he could articulate his vision when talking to someone who truly understood the complexity of creating change within existing systems. "Most developers see affordable housing as charity work," Julia said, her usual professional mask slipping as genuine enthusiasm crept into her voice. "But you've figured out how to make it sustainable business. That's revolutionary." "It's not revolutionary if no one will fund it properly," Justin replied, then immediately wished he hadn't revealed so much vulnerability. But Julia's expression wasn't judgmental, it was understanding. "The financing is always the challenge," she agreed. "Banks see affordable as unprofitable, but the long-term stability of these communities actually makes them better investments than luxury developments that price out their own customer base." For both of them, this was the first genuine conversation they'd had in years. No hidden agendas, no corporate politics, no careful calculation of what information was safe to share. Just two brilliant minds recognizing each other across the canyon of their mutual isolation. Then Justin, riding this unprecedented wave of connection and confidence, made his fatal mistake. "I'm planning a new project in Brooklyn," he said, his voice growing stronger as the words flowed. "Sustainable housing that could revolutionize how we think about urban development. The scale is ambitious, 500 units across 3 buildings, completely integrated with existing neighborhood infrastructure. Julia's eyes lit up with genuine interest. This was exactly the kind of innovative thinking she'd been hoping to see in the development world. The financing structure alone would be fascinating, she said. The environmental impact assessments, the community integration costs, the long-term value projections, it's the kind of project that could change industry standards. Justin felt a surge of hope and possibility that he hadn't experienced since his father's death. Here was someone who understood his vision, who could see the potential he'd been struggling to articulate to skeptical investors. "Well, I need someone brilliant to structure the investment model," he said, the words rushing out before his anxiety could stop them. "Someone who understands both the financial complexity and the social impact. Would you consider partnering with me on this?" The word partnering hit Julia like ice water. Every muscle in her body tensed as memories flooded back Natalie's betrayal, her father's abandonment, every time she'd trusted someone and been left devastated. The enthusiasm drained from her face so quickly that Justin could see the exact moment she disappeared behind her walls. "Mr. Walker," Julia said, her voice suddenly professional and cold, all trace of warmth vanishing as if it had never existed. "I don't do partnerships. I work alone, always." The transformation was so complete that Justin felt physically staggered. One moment they'd been connecting on a level he'd never experienced with another person, and the next she was looking at him like he was a stranger who had committed some unforgivable offense. "I understand that partnerships can be complicated," Justin tried, his newfound confidence crumbling as his social anxiety came crashing back. "But this project could really benefit from—" "No," Julia interrupted, her tone final. "I've built my career on independence. I don't collaborate, I don't share responsibility, and I don't trust other people with my professional reputation. Thank you for the compliment, but the answer is no." Justin felt the rejection like a physical blow, but worse was the look in her eyes, not dismissive, but terrified. He'd seen something real in her during their conversation, a brilliant woman passionate about meaningful work, and his clumsy proposal had made her run. His social anxiety returned with crushing force, and he found himself retreating into the painful silence that had defined most of his adult relationships. "I understand," he managed, though he didn't understand at all. "I apologize for presuming." As he turned to walk away, Julia watched him go, her heart racing with panic and something that might have been regret. She recognized the defeated posture of someone who'd been hurt too many times, the careful way he withdrew when faced with rejection. Part of her wanted to call after him, to explain that her refusal wasn't about him, but about her own fear of trusting anyone ever again. But fear won, as it always did. She watched Justin disappear into the crowd, knowing she'd just pushed away the first person in years who had understood her work and seen her as more than just the Ice Queen. The knowledge that she'd done it to herself made it worse, not better. Both of them left the gala early, carrying the weight of a connection that had been real and precious and destroyed before it could fully form. 2 years passed before their carefully constructed defenses finally crumbled completely. For Julia, the destruction came from the very walls that had protected her throughout her career. The project started as routine market analysis, a comprehensive study of emerging housing market trends in the Northeast Corridor. It was exactly the kind of complex, multi-layered analysis that had built Julia's reputation, but this time the scope was larger than anything she'd tackled alone. Her assistant Mark, a bright young analyst who'd been trying to break through Julia's professional barriers for months, approached her desk with obvious nervousness. "Julia, this project is massive," he said, clutching a stack of preliminary data reports. "We're talking about analyzing housing patterns across 12 major metropolitan areas, factoring in environmental policy changes, demographic shifts, and regulatory variations across 6 states. Maybe we should consider bringing in additional analysts, or at least consulting with the regional specialists." Julia looked up from her computer screen, her expression immediately hardening. "I've been handling complex analyses since before you graduated college, Mark. I don't need help, and I certainly don't need input from other analysts who might compromise the integrity of my methodology. But the datasets alone are overwhelming." Mark pressed, his concern overriding his intimidation. "The Northeast Housing Council is expecting projections that could influence billions in development decisions. If we miss something—" "We won't miss anything," Julia cut him off, her voice sharp with dismissal. "I will not miss anything. I work alone because I work best alone. Other people introduce variables I can't control, perspectives I can't verify, and agendas I can't trust. This analysis will be thorough and accurate because I will personally review every data point." Mark retreated, but his worry was justified. Over the following weeks, Julia worked 18-hour days, analyzing data that should have required a team of specialists. Her refusal to collaborate, to seek second opinions, to verify her conclusions with experts in related fields, created exactly the kind of blind spot Mark had feared. The housing market was shifting in ways that were subtle but significant. Environmental regulations were changing more rapidly than historical data suggested. Demographic patterns were influenced by factors that hadn't been relevant in previous market cycles. Most critically, new financial instruments were affecting lending patterns in ways that traditional analysis methods couldn't detect. A team of analysts, each bringing different expertise and perspectives, would have caught these emerging trends. But Julia, brilliant as she was, couldn't see everything from her isolated position at the top of her ivory tower. When the comprehensive report was delivered to Harrison Pharmaceuticals' real estate division, it projected continued stability in markets that were actually on the verge of significant correction. Based on Julia's analysis, Harrison committed $800 million to development projects that would become worthless within 6 months. The market crash, when it came, was swift and devastating. Housing values plummeted in exactly the regions Julia had identified as stable growth markets. Development projects ground to a halt, leaving Harrison with massive losses and Julia with the destruction of her reputation. The meeting where her termination was announced was brutal in its efficiency. Julia sat across from her boss, David Chen, and Harrison's CEO, watching her career dissolve in real time. $800 million. Harrison's CEO said, his voice cold with barely controlled fury. $800 million lost because your analysis missed every single warning sign that a competent team would have caught. David Chen, who had hired Julia and defended her methods for years, looked genuinely pained as he delivered the final blow. "Maybe if you'd worked with others instead of acting like you're the only smart person in the room," he said quietly. "Maybe if you weren't so damn paranoid about collaboration, you'd still have a career." But Julia barely heard the specifics of their criticism. All she could focus on was the crushing realization that her protection had become her destruction. Her refusal to trust, to collaborate, to depend on anyone had created the very failure she'd spent her career trying to avoid. Security escorted her from the building that afternoon, her personal belongings in a cardboard box, her reputation in ruins. The whispers, mostly fueled by Natalie, followed her down the hallway. The Ice Queen finally melted. Pride comes before the fall. Should have known she couldn't handle the big leagues alone. That same week, Justin faced his own reckoning. His most important projecta, sustainable community development in the Bronx that represented everything he believed about responsible urban planning, was failing because he couldn't advocate for it when it mattered most. The project was revolutionary in scope. 200 affordable housing units integrated with green spaces, community centers, and local business development opportunities. It would provide homes for 50 families while creating jobs and improving the entire neighborhood. For Justin, it represented proof that business could serve humanity rather than exploit it. But the financing was complex, requiring coordination between city agencies, private investors, and community organizations. The project needed someone who could passionately articulate its vision, defend its unconventional approaches, and rally support when skeptics raised concerns. The crucial investor meeting took place on a Tuesday morning in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the construction site. Around the table sat the people who would determine whether Justin's dream became reality or died in committee: city planning officials, bank representatives, community leaders, and the private investors whose backing would make everything possible. Justin had prepared for weeks. His presentation materials were flawless, his financial projections solid, his environmental impact studies comprehensive. But as the meeting progressed and the questions became more challenging, his lifelong nemesis returned with devastating force. "The cost projections seem optimistic," said the lead banker, a woman whose skeptical expression suggested she'd seen too many idealistic projects fail. "Sustainable building materials cost 20% more than standard options. Community integration requires ongoing social programming that most developments don't budget for. How do you justify these expenses to investors who could get better returns from traditional luxury developments?" Justin felt his throat begin to tighten. This was exactly the kind of question he'd anticipated, the kind of challenge that required passionate advocacy for values over pure profit. He knew the answer: that sustainable communities created long-term value through lower maintenance costs, higher resident satisfaction, and positive neighborhood impact. But as all eyes turned to him, waiting for his response, the words wouldn't come. The long-term benefits," he started, then stopped as his voice cracked with anxiety. The room fell silent, everyone waiting for him to continue, to fight for his vision, to explain why this project mattered more than simple financial returns. But Justin's social anxiety, triggered by the pressure of the moment and the weight of so many lives depending on his ability to speak, rendered him completely mute. He sat there, opening and closing his mouth, his brilliant mind racing with arguments he couldn't voice. Minutes passed in increasingly uncomfortable silence. The community leader, an elderly woman whose neighborhood would be transformed by the project, looked at Justin with growing concern. The investors exchanged glances that clearly questioned whether this man could be trusted with their money. Finally, the lead investor, a man who had initially been enthusiastic about the project's potential, stood up with obvious frustration. "Mr. Walker," he said, his tone final, "you're clearly brilliant on paper, but if you can't fight for your own project, if you can't articulate why we should believe in this vision, then why should we?" The meeting ended with handshakes that felt like funeral rites. Within a week, the funding was withdrawn, the permits were canceled, and the community that had been promised affordable homes was left with nothing but an empty lot and broken dreams. Both Julia and Justin had finally understood the cruel irony of their lives. Julia's paranoid independence, born from her fear of betrayal, had created the very professional catastrophe she'd spent her career trying to avoid. Justin's protective silence, developed to shield himself from the pain of failed communication, had caused exactly the kind of humanitarian failure that haunted his nightmares. They had built walls to protect themselves, only to discover that those walls had become their prisons. Their greatest strengths, Julia's analytical independence and Justin's careful consideration, had metastasized into their greatest weaknesses. They were successful, respected, and completely alone, finally understanding that the very mechanisms they'd developed for survival had become the instruments of their destruction. The Blue Moon Jazz Club in Brooklyn had become Julia's sanctuary, the only place in New York where she could let her carefully constructed mask slip without fear of professional consequences. 6 months after her termination from Goldman Sachs, she sat in her usual corner booth, nursing a whiskey and trying to pretend she wasn't quietly falling apart. The club was dimly lit and intimate, with exposed brick walls that absorbed sound and created the kind of acoustic cocoon that made even the loneliest person feel held. Julia had discovered it during her first week of unemployment, drawn by its promise of anonymity and the kind of music that didn't demand anything from its listeners except presence. Tonight, had been particularly brutal. Another job interview, another polite rejection, another reminder that her reputation in the financial world was permanently tarnished. The interviewer, a woman barely older than Julia, had looked at her with barely concealed pity. "Your analytical skills are obviously impressive," she'd said, "but we're looking for someone who can work collaboratively. Our team environment requires a lot of cooperation and shared decision-making. Given your previous challenges with teamwork, we've decided to go with a candidate who's a better cultural fit." Julia had walked out of that meeting with her head held high, but now, alone in the jazz club with only the saxophone's melancholy notes for company, she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her destruction. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she stared into her whiskey, wondering how someone who had once been so powerful could feel so completely powerless. Meanwhile, across Manhattan, Justin hadn't left his penthouse in 3 weeks. The guilt over his failed housing project had consumed him entirely. He spent his days staring out at Central Park, thinking about the 50 families who were still living in substandard housing because he couldn't find his voice when they needed him to fight for their future. His assistant Rebecca had been calling daily, begging him to emerge from his self-imposed exile. "You can't fix the past by hiding from the present," she'd said during their last conversation. "Maybe getting out would help you remember who you are beyond this one failure." Finally, desperate for any escape from his own thoughts, Justin remembered something Rebecca had mentioned months ago, small jazz club in Brooklyn, where she sometimes went to unwind. He'd never been to a jazz club in his life, but tonight he needed to be anywhere other than alone with his regrets. When Justin walked into the Blue Moon, the first thing he noticed was how different it felt from the Manhattan establishments he usually frequented. There was no pretense here, no networking or corporate posturing. Just music and people seeking solace in shared solitude. Then he saw her. Julia Tucker sat alone in a corner booth, and even in the dim lighting, Justin could see that she was crying. Not the controlled, professional tears of someone maintaining composure, but the raw, broken sobs of someone who had finally reached the end of their strength. The sight hit him like a physical blow. This was the woman he'd admired from afar, the brilliant analyst whose work he'd studied obsessively, whose mind he'd respected above all others in their industry. Seeing her reduced to this successful, untouchable Julia Tucker weeping alone in a jazz club broke something open in his chest. For the first time in months, Justin's social anxiety completely disappeared. Not because the situation was comfortable, but because her pain was so much greater than his fear. He walked to the bar, ordered 2 whiskeys, and approached her table with steady steps. "The great Julia Tucker doesn't cry," he said gently, setting 1 glass in front of her. Julia looked up through her tears, and for a moment she didn't recognize him. Then her eyes widened as she realized who was standing beside her booth, Justin Walker, the billionaire developer whose sustainable housing vision she'd once found so compelling. "The great Julia Tucker doesn't exist anymore," she said bitterly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Haven't you heard? I'm the analyst who lost $800 million because she was too paranoid to accept help." Justin slid into the booth across from her, noting how her usual professional armor had been completely stripped away. In its place was raw vulnerability that made her seem younger and infinitely more human. "And I'm the developer who couldn't speak up to save 50 families from homelessness," he replied quietly. "Seems we're both disasters now." They sat in silence for several minutes, 2 broken people sharing space, if not trust. The jazz trio on stage played something mournful and beautiful, the kind of music that gave permission for honesty in the darkness. Finally, Julia spoke, her voice barely audible above the saxophone. "I had an assistant who begged me to get help on a project. A brilliant kid who could see things I was missing, who wanted to bring in specialists, who knew more than I did about regional markets. I was so terrified of being betrayed again that I refused every offer of collaboration." She took a sip of whiskey, its burn grounding her in the present moment. Families lost their homes because I couldn't trust anyone enough to admit I might not see everything alone. Justin felt the familiar tightness in his throat. But this time, it wasn't anxiety, it was recognition. Well, I had 50 families counting on me to fight for their housing project too, he said, his voice rough with emotion. When investors challenged the vision, when they questioned whether sustainable development was worth the extra cost, I couldn't find words to defend what I believed in. They lost their chance at homeownership because I couldn't be brave enough to speak when it mattered. Looking at each other across the small table, they saw something they'd never encountered before, someone else who understood that their greatest strengths had become their greatest weaknesses. Julia saw in Justin the same painful isolation that defined her own existence, the way brilliance could become a prison when it was never shared with another soul. Justin saw in Julia the same self-imposed exile he'd been living, the way protecting yourself could end up destroying everything you claim to protect. I spent so many years building walls to keep people from hurting me, Julia said, her voice gaining strength as she articulated truths she'd never spoken aloud. But those walls didn't just keep out the bad, they kept out everything. Every opportunity to grow, every chance to learn from someone else, every possibility that maybe not everyone is Natalie. Natalie? Justin asked gently. Well, a college roommate who stole my thesis and got the Goldman Sachs internship I should have had, Julia explained, surprised by how easily the words came. She still works there, actually. Watched me rise above her for years, probably celebrated when I fell. Justin nodded with understanding. I spent so many years afraid of saying the wrong thing that I stopped saying anything meaningful at all. I thought silence was safer than vulnerability, but silence just became another kind of prison. When people needed me to fight for them, I had nothing to offer but fear. They finished their whiskeys in contemplative quiet, each processing the strange comfort of being truly seen by someone who understood their particular brand of brokenness. We're quite a pair, Julia said with the first genuine smile she'd managed in months. The woman who trusts no one and the man who can't speak when it matters. At least we're failing spectacularly, Justin replied, and Julia actually laughed at a sound so unexpected in her current circumstances that it surprised them both. As the jazz club began to empty around them, Justin found himself reluctant to let this moment end. For the first time in years, he was talking to someone who understood, not just his professional work, but his personal struggles. Julia seemed equally hesitant to return to her lonely apartment and the stack of rejection letters waiting on her kitchen table. I have a proposal, Justin said carefully, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to suggest. I own a small house in the Caribbean, nothing fancy, just a place I bought years ago and never use. I was planning to go there for a few days to clear my head before I figure out what comes next. Julia's immediate instinct was to refuse. She didn't accept charity, didn't depend on others for solutions to her problems, and certainly didn't trust men who made offers that seemed too generous to be real. You could come too, Justin continued, seeing the wariness in her eyes. Just for a couple of days. We both need to get away from the city, from our failures, from the constant reminders of what we've lost. Just to think, to breathe, to figure out what we want our lives to look like going forward. Julia's mind raced through all the reasons this was a bad idea. She barely knew him, despite their brief encounter 2 years ago. She couldn't afford to be away from job hunting for any extended period. She didn't have money for flights or expenses. Most importantly, accepting help from anyone felt like admitting defeat in a way that terrified her. But something in his eyes, the same desperate need for escape she felt, the same exhaustion from carrying failure alone made her hesitate. Just a few days, she said finally, her voice firmer than she felt. I can't afford to be away longer, and I need to get back to rebuilding my career. Just a few days? Justin agreed, though part of him hoped circumstances might allow for more time if she found the change of scenery helpful. We'll both figure out our next moves with clearer heads. 3 days later, they met at JFK Airport. both carrying small bags and carefully maintained emotional distance. Julia had booked her return flight for the following Friday. 4 days total, she'd decided, was reasonable for someone in her financial situation. Justin had made similar arrangements, though he'd left his return date slightly more flexible. Separate rooms. Julia had specified when they discussed logistics over the phone. "I appreciate the offer, but I need to be clear that this is just two people taking a break from the city at the same time." "Of course," Justin had agreed. "The house has 3 bedrooms. We'll probably barely see each other anyway. I tend to take long walks on the beach, and you'll probably want space to think about your next career moves." As their plane lifted off from New York, both stared out their respective windows at the city that had built them up and torn them down. Julia watched Manhattan shrink below them and reminded herself this was temporary, just long enough to gain perspective before returning to the job hunt with renewed energy. Justin sat 3 rows behind Julia, close enough to offer assistance if needed, but far enough away to respect the boundaries she'd established. He found himself watching the back of her head, wondering what she was thinking as familiar landmarks disappeared beneath the clouds. For Julia, the airplane window became a mirror reflecting on the ruins of her carefully constructed life, just long enough to think, she whispered to herself, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. 4 days to figure out how to rebuild everything I've lost. Justin closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer to whatever forces governed second chances. Maybe longer if she wants, he thought, not daring to voice the hope that this brief escape might become something more healing for both of them. Neither spoke during the flight, but both carried the same unspoken question. What did it mean that they were running away from their failures together? They were bringing their walls to paradise, their fears to a place of healing, their isolation to a shared space. Whether that would lead to breakthrough or simply a change of scenery remained to be seen. The plane descended toward turquoise waters and white sand beaches, carrying 2 wounded souls toward either deeper isolation or the beginning of something. Neither had dared to hope for the possibility that their greatest weaknesses, when shared with the right person, might somehow become sources of strength. The house was exactly as Justin had described, modest by his standards, but breathtaking in its simplicity. A 3-bedroom cottage perched on a quiet stretch of Caribbean beach, with wide windows that let in ocean breezes and the kind of natural light that made everything feel possible again. Julia claimed the bedroom with the best ocean view, while Justin took the master suite on the opposite side of the house. They moved around each other like careful strangers, establishing routines that ensured minimal interaction despite sharing the same space. Julia set up her laptop on the deck each morning, working on freelance projects and sending out applications for permanent positions. The ocean view was distracting at first, but she forced herself to maintain the discipline that had defined her career. Every few hours, she reminded herself that Friday was only days away, that this was temporary respite, not permanent escape. Justin took long walks on the beach at dawn and sunset, making business calls about liquidating some of his properties and considering offers from firms that wanted to acquire his sustainable housing patents. He kept his distance from Julia's workspace, respecting the boundaries she'd established while secretly hoping for opportunities to connect. They were polite during their brief encounters, sharing coffee in the morning, nodding when they passed in hallways, exchanging pleasantries about the weather and the beauty of their surroundings. But underneath the courtesy was a growing tension neither wanted to acknowledge. They were both more comfortable here than they'd been anywhere in years. Julia found herself working more efficiently than she had since her termination. The peace of the island, the absence of corporate pressure, the simple routine of waking to ocean sounds instead of traffic noise, it all contributed to a clarity of thought she hadn't experienced in months. But she pushed down any acknowledgement of this improvement, reminding herself that Friday's departure was non-negotiable. Justin discovered that his anxiety levels had dropped significantly since arriving. Without the constant noise and social pressure of Manhattan, he found himself sleeping better, thinking more clearly, even humming along to the music that drifted from Julia's workspace during the day. But he, too, maintained strict mental discipline about the temporary nature of their arrangement. Both were counting down to Friday departure, but both were also secretly dreading the return to their separate New York failures. The underlying tension wasn't romanticity, was the growing recognition that healing was possible, that peace wasn't just a luxury but a necessity they'd both been denying themselves for years. Wednesday night changed everything. Julia had been working on a crucial freelance project, a market analysis, for a small investment firm that represented her best chance at rebuilding her reputation. She'd spent 3 days perfecting every detail, every projection, every recommendation. It was the kind of work that could prove she was still capable of brilliant analysis despite her previous failure. Then her laptop crashed. Not just a simple malfunction, but a complete hard drive failure that took with it the only copy of her project. No backup, no cloud storage, no way to recover weeks of meticulous work. The deadline was tomorrow. The client was counting on her analysis, and Julia's one chance at professional redemption had just vanished into digital oblivion. She stared at the black screen for several minutes, pressing the power button repeatedly, as if sheer will could resurrect her destroyed work. Then the full magnitude of her loss hit her, and Julia Tucker, brilliant, controlled, unshakable Julia Tucker, completely fell apart. Justin found her on the kitchen floor 20 minutes later, surrounded by the pieces of her laptop, sobbing with the kind of deep, body-shaking despair that comes from finally hitting absolute bottom. "I can't do anything right," she wept, her voice broken and raw. "I can't trust people, can't work with people, can't even keep a stupid computer working long enough to finish one project. Maybe everyone's right, maybe I am just a paranoid failure who's too damaged to function in the real world." For the first time in Justin's adult life, his social anxiety disappeared completely. Not because the situation was comfortable, but because seeing Julia's pain overrode every fear he'd ever had about saying the wrong thing. Her need was greater than his terror, her brokenness more important than his self-protection. He sat down on the kitchen floor beside her, his voice steady and certain in a way it had never been during moments of emotional crisis. "You're not paranoid," he said, his words cutting through her sobs with gentle authority. "You're terrified. There's a difference. And you're not a failure. You're someone who's been hurt so badly that protecting yourself became more important than living." Julia looked up at him through her tears, shocked by the certainty in his voice, the way he spoke about her pain as if he truly understood its origins. "People left you," Justin continued, finding words he'd never been able to access during his own relationships. "You told me how your father abandoned you when you were 7. Even your best friend. How she betrayed you when you trusted her with your most important work. So, you probably learned to leave first, to need no one, to build walls so high that no one could hurt you again. That's not paranoia, that's survival." "But maybe I've survived long enough," Julia whispered, her crying beginning to slow as she heard her own story reflected back to her with such compassion. "Maybe we both have," Justin replied. "Maybe it's time to try living instead of just surviving." Julia stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time how her fear had become a weapon she used against anyone who tried to get close. The realization was devastating and liberating in equal measure. "What if we practiced?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. "What if we tried trusting and being brave with each other first? Just here, where it's safe, where there's no one else who can hurt us." "What if we extended our stay?" Justin found himself saying, the words emerging from a place of courage he'd never accessed before. "Just a little longer, to figure this out." Julia nodded, and neither of them mentioned rebooking their Friday flights. Friday came and went without discussion of departure. Then the following Friday, what had started as just a few more days became a week, then 2 weeks, then a month, then 3 months. Every few days, one of them would mention leaving, but somehow they kept finding reasons to stay just a little longer. "I should probably head back to New York soon," Julia would say while curled up on the couch reading, making no move toward her laptop to book flights. "Probably," Justin would agree while cooking dinner for both of them, his tone suggesting no urgency whatsoever. Each extension was justified with practical excuses. Julia needed more time to rebuild her client base. Justin was waiting for the right offer on his Manhattan penthouse. The weather was particularly beautiful that week. Flight prices were expensive during peak season, but the real reason was simpler and more terrifying. They were both happier than they'd been in years. Julia had to learn to accept help in ways that felt foreign and dangerous. She let Justin cook dinner, without offering to reimburse him for groceries. She asked his opinion on freelance projects and actually considered his suggestions. She shared her fears about the future instead of pretending she had everything under control. Every instinct screamed that depending on him would lead to heartbreak, that sharing her vulnerabilities would give him power to destroy her. But she forced herself to stay present with the discomfort, to experience connection, without immediately building walls against it. Justin had to learn to use his voice in ways that had terrified him his entire adult life. When Julia doubted herself, he defended her capabilities with passionate certainty. When she talked about giving up on her dreams, he articulated visions for her future that she couldn't see herself. When his own fears arose, he spoke honestly about his feelings, instead of retreating into protective silence. Every conversation felt like jumping off a cliff, but he kept jumping. Each time he successfully communicated something meaningful, each time Julia responded with understanding instead of rejection, his confidence grew incrementally. Both were terrified by their growing comfort with each other, but both were committed to the experiment they'd begun. They practiced trust in small increments, Julia allowing Justin to handle dinner reservations, Justin asking Julia to review his business correspondence. They practiced vulnerability in measured doses, sharing childhood memories, discussing professional regrets, acknowledging fears about their uncertain futures. Month 3 brought their first real conflict, and with it, the return of all their old defensive patterns. Julia, frustrated by a particularly difficult freelance client who kept changing project parameters, snapped at Justin when he offered to help review her contract terms. "I don't need you hovering over my work," she said coldly, her professional mask sliding back into place. "I was handling difficult clients before I met you, and I'll be handling them long after this temporary arrangement ends." The word temporary hung in the air between them like a challenge. For 3 months, they'd been living as if their island sanctuary could last indefinitely, but Julia's sharp reminder brought reality crashing back. "Maybe this was a mistake," she continued, her old fears surging back with devastating force. "I was supposed to be here for 4 days, not 3 months. I'm getting too comfortable, too dependent. Maybe I should go back to New York where I belong." Instead of retreating into hurt silence like the old Justin would have done, something fundamental had shifted in him during their months together. He'd found his voice, and he wasn't going to lose it now when he needed to fight for what they'd built. "No," he said firmly, his voice stronger than it had ever been during moments of emotional crisis. "You don't get to run away because you're scared. We promised we'd try this together, remember? That includes the part where you fail at trusting me sometimes." "This was supposed to be temporary," Julia shot back, but her voice was shaking now. "A few days to clear our heads, not whatever this is becoming." "Then leave," Justin said, his heart breaking but his voice steady. "Pack your bags, book a flight, and go back to New York. Spend the rest of your life alone and safe and miserable. But don't pretend it's because this was supposed to be temporary. It's because you're too scared to admit you want it to be permanent." Julia stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time how her fear had become a prison she carried with her everywhere. The wall she'd built to protect herself had become the very thing keeping her from the connection she desperately craved. After a long while of silence, "I'm terrified," she whispered, her defenses finally crumbling completely. Me too, Justin replied, crossing the room to take her hands in his. But I'm more terrified of you leaving than I am of you staying. That night, as tropical rain fell softly outside their cottage, Julia came to Justin's room. Her heart was pounding with terror and desire in equal measure, but she was done running from the scary thing. She was ready to run toward it instead. "I don't want to go back to New York," she whispered in the darkness. "I don't want you to go back too," he replied, pulling her close. Their closeness leading to a kiss that deepened as months of suppressed feelings emerged. When they made love for the first time, it was with the desperate intensity of two people finally admitting what they'd been denying for months. As Julia moved above him, her walls finally completely down, Justin looked into her eyes and saw his future. "You're mine forever," he whispered against her lips, the words torn from the deepest part of his soul. "Not just for a few days, not just for now, forever." Instead of running, instead of building new walls, Julia smiled through her tears and whispered back, "Forever." As their bodies moved in a rhythm both never wanted to stop. Their fragile new reality faced its ultimate test when the outside world intruded 4 months into their island sanctuary. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Justin was making breakfast, the phone's harsh ring cutting through the peaceful sounds of ocean waves, and Julia's quiet typing from the deck. "Mr. Walker, this is Robert Harrison, from Metropolitan Development Group," the voice said with the kind of confidence that came from making offers people couldn't refuse. "We've been following your work in sustainable housing, and we have a proposition that could restore everything you lost in New York." Justin's hand tightened on the phone as Harrison outlined the offer: a full partnership in Metropolitan's expansion into affordable housing, complete control over the Sustainable Development Division, and enough funding to build the communities Justin had only dreamed about. It was everything he'd thought he wanted before his world collapsed. "There's just one requirement," Harrison continued. "We need you back in New York immediately. The projects are time-sensitive luxury developments with sustainable elements that could revolutionize how high-end housing approaches environmental responsibility." Luxury developments. The words hit Justin like ice water. These weren't the community-focused, truly affordable housing projects that had driven his original vision. They were luxury developments with environmental window dressing, designed to make wealthy buyers feel good about their consumption while doing nothing for the families who actually needed housing. When Julia saw Justin's expression after he hung up, her own fears immediately activated. She'd been waiting for this moment, the inevitable return to reality, the end of their impossible island dream. "Take it," she said before he could even explain the offer, her voice sharp with the kind of protective panic she'd been fighting for months. "You need this, Justin. We can't hide on this island forever pretending the real world doesn't exist." But Justin realized that accepting would mean becoming his old self, the man who couldn't speak up for what mattered, who chose security over values, who let fear drive his decisions. "What if we didn't hide?" he asked, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was suggesting. "What if we built something here, together, something that actually serves the people who need it most?" Meanwhile, Julia's own test came 3 days later, delivered through an email that made her hand shake as she read it. Goldman Sachs was offering her an executive position, not just any position, but Senior Vice President of Strategic Analysis with a guaranteed team, a 7-figure salary, and complete autonomy over her department. "We've reconsidered your departure," the email read. "Recent market volatility has proven that your original analysis, while costly in the short term, accurately predicted long-term trends. We'd like to discuss bringing you back in a leadership role that plays to your strengths while addressing previous collaboration challenges." It was everything Julia had thought she wanted: safety, independence, respect, the chance to prove that her termination had been a mistake. The position came with enough authority that she'd never have to worry about betrayal again. She'd be the one making decisions, not trusting others with her professional fate. But as she stared at the email, her first instinct wasn't excitement, it was terror. Not of the job itself, but of what accepting it would mean. She'd have to leave the island, leave Justin, leave the first place she'd felt truly safe in over a decade. "This is crazy," she said aloud, pacing their small living room while Justin watched with concerned eyes. "I know I'm living in a fantasy, but I still need a real career, real security, real control over my future. I can't build a life on freelance projects and island dreams." "What if we made this real?" Justin asked quietly. "What if we started something together that was bigger than either of our old careers?" The word "together" sent Julia's protective instincts into overdrive. Every lesson she'd learned about self-reliance, every wall she'd built against dependence, every fear about trusting someone with her future, it all came rushing back with devastating force. "What if it fails?" she demanded, her voice rising with panic. "What if you change your mind? What if you decide island life isn't enough and you want to go back to building your empire? What if you leave me here with nothing after I reject this offer?" "What if it works?" Justin interrupted, his voice calm but determined. "What if for once, instead of running from the scary thing, we run toward it?" After long deliberation, they both finally accepted to take the leap of faith and started with a single sustainable housing project on a neighboring island, 24 units, designed for local families who had been priced out of their own communities by resort development. Julia handled the complex international financing, navigating currency exchanges, government regulations, and investor relations with the kind of skill that had made her legendary on Wall Street. But this time, she wasn't working alone. She collaborated with local officials, consulted with community leaders, and most terrifyingly, trusted Justin's vision even when she couldn't see the complete financial picture. Every day was a battle against her instinct to control every variable, to trust no one's judgment but her own. Justin managed community relations and design, forcing himself to present to skeptical government boards and traditional developers who questioned every aspect of their approach. His voice grew stronger with each presentation, his confidence building as he learned to advocate passionately for families who needed affordable homes. Their first project was completed in 8 months in time, under budget, and with waiting lists of families desperate for similar opportunities in their own communities. By their third project signing, Julia and Justin had established a partnership that defied every assumption they'd held about their own limitations. Julia was animatedly discussing microfinancing options with Caribbean development officials, her isolation replaced by engaged collaboration. Justin was addressing a room full of international investors, his voice strong and clear as he advocated for expansion into Central America. "Ready for the next one?" Julia asked, taking his hand as children played in the green spaces they'd designed for their latest community. "With you?" Justin replied, squeezing her fingers. "I'm ready for anything. Forever." The community center opening for their second project drew families from across the region. Julia watched toddlers play on playgrounds she'd helped fund, saw elderly residents gathering in social spaces Justin had designed, witnessed teenagers using computer labs that existed because they'd refused to choose safety over purpose. "Look what we built," she whispered to Justin as they stood together watching 3 generations of one family explore their new home. "Look what we built together," he corrected, and Julia no longer flinched at the word that had once terrified her. Later that night, as they lay in bed in their island home, no longer temporary, no longer an escape from reality, but the foundation of a new life, Julia traced patterns on Justin's chest. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Giving up New York, the partnership offer, the old life where everything was predictable?" Justin captured her hand, bringing it to his lips with the kind of reverence that still made her heart race. "You mean, do I regret the best decision I ever made? Never. Even though I was supposed to leave after 4 days? Especially because you stayed," he said, rolling her onto her back as he hovered over her, looking into her eyes with the intensity that had become familiar over their months together. "You're mine forever, remember? I said it. You agreed." and I'm holding you to it." Julia laughed, the sound free and unguarded in a way that would have been impossible during her Wall Street years. "Forever's a long time." "Not long enough," Justin whispered against her lips, and Julia knew he meant it. They'd learned that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come disguised as temporary arrangement, few days that become months, a healing retreat that becomes home, a shared brokenness that becomes unshakable strength. They discovered that love isn't about finding someone perfect, but finding someone worth rebuilding your entire world for, one terrifying day at a time. Outside their window, the Caribbean waves continued their eternal rhythm, and inside their hearts, two people who had once been too afraid to trust anyone had found something worth trusting forever. My dear family, Julia and Justin's story isn't just about two broken people finding love. It's about every single one of us who's ever been so afraid of temporary pain that we've chosen permanent loneliness. They learned that love isn't about finding someone perfect, it's about finding someone worth rebuilding your entire world for, one terrifying day at a time. They discovered that sometimes our greatest weaknesses, when shared with the right person, become our greatest strengths. Now, I want to hear from you, really hear from you. In the comments, tell me, what walls have you built that might be keeping out the very love you're seeking? Use the words, "my wall is," and complete that sentence. Your vulnerability might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to know that temporary can become forever when two scared hearts decide to be brave together. Subscribe if you believe in the healing power of love stories that show us who we could become when we're brave enough to let someone see our scars. Until our next story, remember, you are worthy of love that stays, love that grows, love that transforms your deepest fears into your greatest strengths. Someone out there is looking for exactly your kind of broken, exactly your kind of brave. Sweet dreams, beautiful family. Your forever love is out there, probably disguised as something temporary, waiting for you to be brave enough to say, "What if we stayed?"